Okay, let's move to bigger things, not necessarily bigger and better. This is life now. So 10 kilos to 100 kilos, 20 pounds to 200 pounds, starting with a pair of shoes. 1.5 kilograms CO2 equivalent if they're Crocs. I think everybody know what Crocs are. They are made from very light material, usually sold without any packaging, durable. I don't know if it fits everybody's sense of aesthetics. So clothes, shoes, watches, luxury wear or normal wear, whatever you want to call. Obviously people have personal preferences. Crocs may not be for everybody. 8 kilograms CO2 equivalent if it's a synthetic pair of shoes, and some of them now look fantastically similar to leather and so on, and are actually durable because you can wear them in the rain and they don't get spoiled. They don't need kind of maintenance that leather tends to need. 11.5 kilograms CO2 equivalent is the average if you just take a number of shoes and compute carbon footprint across them. Jumps to 15 kilograms if it is a shoe that's made all leather. So Imelda Marcos's collection, maybe many of them don't even know who Imelda Marcos is. She was the wife of the Philippine dictator. She had 2,700 pairs, sorry that one is extra there, of shoes which would have, so her collection of 2,700 pairs of shoes would have had a carbon footprint of around 30 tons or 3 years worth of 10-ton living, assuming of course that they had all been typical shoes, and very unlikely that she bought typical shoes. They were probably gold tipped, diamond laced, and so on and so forth. So one can imagine that the footprints of some of her shoes were much higher, but you can see how shoes can add up, and it's very common for rich people, movie stars and so on to have large number of pairs of shoes, and so it goes. The glamour of their life probably requires that they have shoes that everybody notices them, or they are given shoes to wear so that they can advertise the shoes for the company, right? Cheese. Who doesn't like cheese? 1 kilogram of cheese has 12 kilograms of CO2 equivalent if it's hard cheese. We've been talking about milk, dairy, beef, all in general expensive, right? So that's about 3 kilograms of CO2 equivalent for a big 250 gram block of cheese from the store, equivalent to a 4-mile drive or a massive 12 kilogram of carrots. Just make some random comparisons. Cheese tends to get wasted a lot. It can sit in the fridge and then collect mold, and then people tend to throw it away. So the advice you get in the US is to discard any soft cheese which develops mold. Then it becomes unsafe to eat. But if it's hard cheese, such as cheddar, cut off at least 1 inch around and below the mold. Keep the knife out of the mold itself, so you carve around it. After trimming off the mold, the remaining cheese should be safe to eat. Recover the cheese in fresh wrap and keep it refrigerated. As you know, the French are famous for their penchant for cheese. They love their cheese, and some of the cheese stinks like hell, and there is plenty of evidence that you get good microbiome from the cheese. So cheese is good, and it does go well with a lot of the wines as well. So we can revisit the carbon footprint of food here again to make some additional points. How much impact does food have? We have seen this in many ways, so we will look at it again here as a proportion of total greenhouse gas emissions that is coming from the food production industry. 1/4 of global emissions come from food. Okay, so agriculture in general. Food is 26% of the total greenhouse gas, 74% coming from other. A lot of it is from energy. Of course, some energy gets used in food as well. Energy gets used for transportation, building, industries, and so on. And then you have others like cement and so on. More than half of the food emissions come from animal products, so that again re-emphasizes the high carbon footprint of a meat diet, which we have been talking about. Animal products contribute 58% of the total food emissions, with 42% coming from the non-animal products. Half of all farmed animal emissions come from beef and lamb. So beef and lamb contribute 50%, and other animal products contribute 50% of the food emissions. So we are just going through this idea of, we looked at fish versus meat and said fish is obviously much better, but it's not necessarily as carbon friendly as you would imagine. Plus, if people shifted from a meat diet to fish diet, the demand for fish could put more pressure on fisheries that have already created massive overexploitation. Large number of fish species are overexploited, and there is ways or agreements to try to protect them, but enforcing conservation sustainability laws in the open ocean is a very difficult issue, as you can imagine. There are other details that when fish is being managed, it is being managed by carving space into chunks in the Pacific, coastal regions, open ocean regions, island regions, separately for the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, and so on. But fish don't care about such boundaries in the ocean. They move across. So this is another problem with trying to manage fisheries. Nonetheless, going back to beef and other foods, beef has the biggest carbon footprint, but the same food can have a range of impacts. Looking here at kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions, now looking at per serving, so this definition has to be carefully remembered as well. Kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per serving. Beef can be low impact. This is the average here, around 8 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per serving, and you can have high impact beef as well. Lamb is lower, but you can see that the average and high impact lamb can be higher than the low impact beef. Chocolate, which is very water intensive product, and there are lots of concerns about exploitation of labor and other issues that are externalities, but just taking to carbon emissions, a chocolate bar from the deforested rainforest emits more than a serving of low impact beef. So low impact beef is here, and a chocolate bar that is coming from chocolate grown in a not so environmentally friendly way, including deforestation, then you know that chocolate is not as carbon friendly as you would think. Here we are with the farmed fish. So low impact, middle, average, and high impact. Pork is, you can see, lower than farmed fish, depending on whether it's the average or low impact pork. Chicken is also almost comparable or lower than farmed fish. So you can imagine. Cheese is here. What can you say? Cheese can be worse than chicken, can be worse than chocolate, low impact chocolate, and low impact chicken, and so on, based on how good you are being in considering what kind of cheese you're buying. Soft cheese is less impactful than hard cheese, if you want to get into those sorts of details. There is beer. You can see that you cannot change the impact of beer too much. Low, average, and high are all very close to each other. Similarly for dairy milk, eggs, coffee can have high impact. Coffee gets a lot of attention as well in terms of deforestation and so on. Tofu and beans and nuts are obviously low. They're very close to zero. So a portion of the highest impact vegetable proteins emits less than the lowest impact animal protein. So getting proteins from vegetable products is always better than getting it from animal products, but as we have been saying, cultural practices, your personal preferences, your taste, etc., can affect your choice. No, everybody cannot be forced to become a vegetarian, but we don't know what will happen in the coming decades anyways, right? The impact of beef is highest in Latin America. So beef is also not produced the same way everywhere, just as we saw with other things like fish or steel being produced with different impacts. Climate footprint of one serving of beef by production region, emissions in kilograms, land use in meter squared, and water use in liters. Latin America tends to be bad, especially in terms of emissions, but also fairly bad in land use and water use. Africa, Oceania, land use is quite large here. North America, being somewhat friendly. Europe is better in terms of land use. Asia is doing much better for land use, but the water use here is much higher. So one has to then figure out how to reduce the overall emissions as well as land use and water use, because water use has other impacts that are not necessarily good, because it can affect food security for some people, and of course access, quantity and quality for other people, because as we saw, cattle raising can produce all kinds of pollution in the water and in the rivers, and N2O release and so on, in addition to the methane release, right? So if you look at kilogram of consumed food, kilogram of CO2 equivalent, post farm gate emissions, including processing, transport, retail, cooking, and waste disposal, versus production emissions, including all emissions before the product leaves the farm. So what happens on the farm and what leaves the farm. Of course, what happens on the farm doesn't stay on the farm. Lamb is coming up high here, with production emissions being high. Okay, so just remember that. Beef is down here, cheese also up there, pork, farmed salmon, turkey, chicken, canned tuna, eggs, potatoes, rice. So you can see where is the footprint higher for post farm gate emissions versus the others. Okay, so this is a nice range of things we have already looked at. We looked at tomatoes, milk, we looked at soybean, we looked at dairy products, rice, we looked at potatoes, eggs, we looked at fish, and so on and so forth. So you can see how they compare. Okay, so the message is still lamb and beef way up there, but in general animal proteins are much worse than vegetable based protein. Okay, so just keep going through these and keep as many things as you want in mind to see how you will make your choices as you go forward, or if you may actually come up with a 10-ton lifestyle and then make a portfolio for food and enjoy things in a sensible way, because you can always adjust. Let's say you want to eat beef one week, then you change your driving habits for that week and do a kind of carbon offset maybe. Okay,